Hey everybody, this is Mark Jesinoski. This is the Wizard Podcast, episode 37. I just got back from a very nice hike at Santa Margarita Trails here outside Fallbrook, California, northern San Diego, where I call home. And today was the first day in a while that I've had the opportunity to leave my phone in a drawer and go for a nice little drive and go down to the trails that I love so much, find my favorite little spot, and just sit there for a while. And what precipitated my going to the trail, maybe I'll bring myself back to the trail, but what precipitated it was waking up this morning, and I don't know what I dreamed about last night. I'm not sure what stuck, but woke up this morning. It's Sunday morning, perhaps because I had the space or I had the time, or I don't know. I don't know what sparked it, but I picked up the Bible and started paging through the Bible. And for those that don't know my background or know me personally, I grew up in rural Minnesota, and I grew up going to church, and I grew up studying the Bible, and I grew up really, without going too far down that tangent, just being very, very curious about my place in the world, and very curious about God, and very curious about the stories I was being told by the adults around me, being very curious about why. Turns out you get yelled at a lot for asking why as a kid. Asking why is in my mind, asking why is the question. All of school should be revolved around why. Let's be curious. Let's go ask that why. Let's pursue that why. Let's look into it. And let's be honest about it. Let's be honest about what we figure out, what we learn, what we come to. Rather than telling our children we know better than them and they need to learn exactly this way, why not allow the why to guide them rather than punishing them for the why? So I was always curious, always very curious. And at the same time had that sense in the body that somehow that curiosity and all the different pathways it brought me down was a sin, was wrong, was bad, was somehow inherently, you don't question authority. To a certain extent, you don't question authority. And it's interesting unraveling that narrative as it's built into my mind and into my body of, what are the things I trust? What are the narratives I trust? What are the stories that I have automatically become a part of along the journey of my life? So I've always found myself in a place of curiosity, and over many years and through, many different stories and many different channels of my life, became very okay with that curiosity and learned to value that curiosity almost more than anything. Learned to trust that curiosity as it related to my internal world and my external world. What is leading me down that pathway? What is leading me down that thought? What is leading me down this particular emotion, or this particular anger that I'm expressing, or this particular way of interacting with the people around me or the world around me? What is leading me there? And is it okay to question it? Is it okay to observe it and notice it and wonder, why is my body pulsing in this way? Why is my body having an automatic, emotional, energetic response to a particular set of circumstances? And looking at how my body, how my mind, how the stories I was told interacted with authority. An authority being a thing, a structure of ideas, a structure of power, a way of perceiving, a way of being. It can be built into the physical framework of your existence. It can be built into the emotional framework of your perception. It can be built into the ideological framework of your perception. But essentially, what are the things that make your body pulse? What are the things that make your body react in a negative way, in a fearful way, in a retracting way, in a cautious way, in a questioning way, in a fearful way? What are those things? How are they written? What are the stories that have led to those sensations in the body and those stories in the mind acting themselves out? And are we automatically acting out those stories and automatically, from the pulse in the body and the reaction in the body and the electrochemical energetic pulse in the body, from that place to acting it out and saying something to someone out of anger, or acting out from anger, or acting out from fear, or acting out from a perspective that you're right or your cause is more just than someone else's, or your perspective is righter than someone else's, and rather than listening or being curious to how others present their perspective of the world, it becomes your job to tell others how to think or how to feel or what those sensations in their body are telling them. We have all these voices that we grow up with telling us, we have our parents, they're very important, but our parents, they've lived a life and they have in some ways become wrapped up in their version of this life and the story they live and the time they grew up in. And there are many powerful voices speaking through all of us. And the one that came into my mind was the pharmaceutical industry that has become so profoundly powerful to the point where it is just part of how we do business, how we exist, how we live. And there's a very, very, very powerful, almost not unspoken, but not debated enough, not acknowledged enough, particularly in my world of psychology or clinical psychology or in the medical world, taking filtering out psychobabble and filtering out overly fancy words, but taking the way that we tell stories about the sensations that people experience in their body, like depression, the patterns of sensations that manifest in something we call depression or that we call anxiety or that we call something. And then we say there's something wrong with the way those patterns are expressing in someone's body. And people want to be contained and they want to be told that they're going to be okay. And they want an authority figure like a doctor to say, you're going to be okay. Here's what's happening to you. This is depression. Here's your pill. This is anxiety. Here's your pill. Depression and anxiety are bad. Depression and anxiety are problems. So we implicitly listen to that. We take it as gospel. We hear it. Our doctors take it as gospel. They barely learn about it. Forgive that. Let me qualify that. The amount of time that is spent training on certain specific factors or ideas is very, very limited. The training is very broad in general, just like mine, and eventually you specialize and you specialize and you specialize. But the point is, people look to doctors and authority figures and the messages and the stories that we tell ourselves through government and media and the structures that we look to inform us about the world we're living in. A lot of times we take those messages as gospel. We believe in those messages. We just think, I guess I'm depressed. I guess I'm anxious. I guess this collection of feelings I'm having that we're saying our symptoms, they're symptoms of something. And because we use a disease model of medicine to understand symptomology and the expression of sensations in our body, in this case, in the psychiatric, psychological space, and those are just words too. But we look at these collections of sensations that we call emotions and we call thoughts, and we look at these different expressions as something that is wrong, as something that is deserving of medication. We treat it like an illness and we try to make it go away. So we suppress the sensations in the body. We attempt to suppress, to numb out, to medicate the sensations of the body as if they're diseases. And we create diseases and disorders out of the language we speak. We speak it into being. We speak it into being. And I'm not saying depression doesn't exist or anxiety doesn't exist. I'm saying being mindful of the language we use to define the sensations that we put together to call depression or call anxiety or call post-traumatic stress or whatever, to understand that these are words that we attach to far more phenomenologically complex stuff in the body, in the mind, and in interpersonal interactions and relationships. Here comes Lucy. I propped the door open today so Lucy could come and go as she pleases. She can come in here and heavy breathe at us for a while, and then she can go explore, look for a cat in the yard or something. So I'm saying that we have allowed voices that are attached to systems of ideas and perceptions and rules and guidelines and beliefs that have a vested interest in us thinking a certain way. Have a vested interest in us thinking a certain way, acting a certain way, behaving a certain way. And I'm saying we should be mindful. We could be mindful. I'll be mindful of saying should. I'm saying that I practice and I like to try to be mindful of why I'm experiencing a certain type of fear, why I'm experiencing a certain sensation in my body, why am I experiencing a sensation of sadness, why am I experiencing a sensation of grief, why am I experiencing a sensation of anger or irritability or fear or love or lust or passion. And as a child and throughout my life, I've been very curious about all of these types of things. And I notice that curiosity will find you bumping up against a lot of rules and a lot of definitions and a lot of ideas and a lot of perceptions that have a vested interest in keeping your mind and your thoughts and your behaviors within a certain maze of thinking and feeling and behaving and interacting and creating and co-creating. So rather than experiencing this thing we call depression as a source of wisdom that is acting out in your body, that's telling you something in your life feels out of your control, something in your life feels threatening, but you can't quite put your finger on it. You know there's a lion dwelling somewhere in the forest, but you just don't quite know where. And every time you try to go out there in the forest, which is your life, you feel very threatened and very overwhelmed and very powerless to all those invisible, passive-aggressive asshole lions out there that are stalking you and making you feel like you lack power in your life, that you lack a voice in your life, that you lack some control. And so the natural sensations that you would feel in your body under those circumstances, living in an environment where you feel powerless, where you might feel hopeless, where you might feel limited, where you might feel invisible, you might feel unheard, rather than looking at those sensations as a source of wisdom that says, hey, something is wrong with this picture. Something is wrong with this environment that we've created. Something is wrong with this world I'm trying to navigate. There's a lot of things that don't feel right in my body. But what happens is all those sensations and feelings that could be sources of wisdom that are telling you about the story you're telling in the context of the environment and the narrative you're living in, rather than looking at them as sources of wisdom, all of us are implicitly told that those sensations you're experiencing in your body are just problems. They're problems that need to go away. Why? Because we have this thing. We have this thing that we need to sell you. We have this thing that we need you to consume every day, twice a day, maybe more, because we've created this thing that we need to help you make go away. We've created a thing that we need you to believe needs to go away. So back to this morning and back to the creek. Woke up this morning feeling a little feisty, decided to crack the Bible. Haven't done it for a while. Paged through Matthew, Mark, Luke. Hung out in John for a little while. And then just started getting real curious about the rest of it. You get into Acts and you get into Galatians and Ephesians and Thessalonians and Timothy and Titus and all these books, and you realize most of these books are written by one dude, a fella named Paul. Paul was really, really good at talking to people, really good at spreading the gospel, really good at spreading the word, really good at building the church. And my intention in this moment is not to draw question there. I'm just speaking out loud in the moment of where my mind was going. I was very curious, as I was as a child, as I would be in church as a child, saying, where did that story come from? Why did that story become told that way? How did that story become told that way? I just realized there, I may edit this out, I don't know, but I just realized that for the first 18 minutes, I didn't have the record button on except the audio, which is fine because none of y'all need to see my face anyway. But given I do that typically, I just stopped and I started the recording again. And those are the fun little things of doing your own podcast and figuring things out and realizing, oh, I didn't drag this picture down into that box, and therefore I only had audio, and that's fine. So I digressed from where I was. So as I woke up this morning and as I was paging through the Bible and as I was reflecting on, all the other times I've spent time reading in the Bible, all this time I spent as a child or a teenager or a young man being curious about that word, but also expansively being curious about all the words, being curious about all the stories we tell, being curious about all the stories that we tell across the human family and the human story, and how those stories are told by us, through us, between us, within us, and recognizing along the way, learning as a very young child, and then in some ways disassembling that even now, learning how uncomfortable it is to question at times, learning how uncomfortable it is to be curious and inquisitive and outspoken, particularly as a child. And recognizing as I was reading through the Bible this morning, and I'm not some Bible scholar and I'm not some person that's, about to try to give some sermons on the Bible, but I've spent a fair amount of time in that space in my life. And as I was becoming more curious this morning, in the context of, I think context is important, because I picked it up this morning knowing this Christmas star is coming a couple days from now, knowing or paying attention to the stories that are being told in our news outlets, in our podcasts, in all of the ways that we tell stories between ourselves and amongst ourselves, and how we tap into those stories. Just being mindful of the multitude of narratives out there of this particular time and place that we are in. And just seeing how invested in, how much people will fight for, and how much they are invested in, and how easily we buy into the stories that we are being told. So I woke up this morning, and again, for context, I pay attention to the news, I pay attention to information, I pay attention to kind of what's going on, but I try to observe it, I try to notice it, I try to notice the stories that are being told, and just be that curious person, just be curious about what's behind those stories, where are they coming from, what's the narrative here, not necessarily looking at those stories as truth, but rather a version of truth that is being disseminated and created and co-created, and we're all buying into by the way we pulse and the way we relate and the way we attach ourselves and act out these stories. You can hear the little yip yappy dog next door, I think, right now. So I like to pay attention, but I like to observe and notice what's being told rather than assuming I should be reacting to it or fearful of it or bend my entire life around it or take it as truth. It's just kind of like, okay, this is another story that's being told, and I can decide how I want to relate to it. The part I want to take in it, the story I want to tell there. Basically, how will I take all that in and practice it with my body? How will I relate to it in my body? How will I inform myself and allow that to influence how I then act out the sensations in my body and the stories in my mind? Do I want to go into agreement with it and co-create it? Or do I want to just chill and step back and take a note? Be a witness to what's taking place and be mindful of how I can relate to it, or what is the best way to relate to it. So that's the context I came into this morning, and the Bible seemed like a good place to go this morning. And so I went into it, and I got into Acts, and I read deeper, and I kept going. I got into Galatians. I think I read a lot of Thessalonians. But what I really noticed in there that I quite honestly had never really taken the time to understand, even though I've listened to sermons about this stuff literally thousands of times in my life, but realizing that much of the New Testament of the Bible and looking at the influence of the Bible and the influence of all of it, realizing that much of it was told and shared and preached by one man who influenced a lot of other people. And I'm not talking about Jesus right now, I'm talking about Paul. And I'm not looking at it critically right now. That's not really where my mind is going right now. what that led me to was looking at the history of Christianity, looking at the history of this book that people take as literal gospel, looking at the interaction of not the gospel of Christ, not the essence of spiritual practice, but looking at the religion of things, looking at again, religion as a structure of ideas, a structure of norms, a structure of rules. Where that led me this morning was down this path of looking at the interaction of religion and government over the past several thousand years. And, looking at the history of Greece and Rome and Europe, and looking at, Paul's letters in the New Testament and how he was going to, Ephesus, and basically going around, Greece and Turkey and Crete and all those areas that were the epicenter of modern, civilization at that point, and was making a case for Christ. And then for me, just looking at the interaction of how there have always been and there will always be people who exploit that, entities who exploit that, powerful organizations, powerful groups of people who want the narrative to be a certain way, who want to manage the narrative, who want to control the narrative, who will utilize religion as politics as a way to control the narrative, as a way to tell you the story that you should support and how you should support it and how you should be a part of it, and what being a good part of that story looks like, what being a good citizen in that story looks like. So I went down those rabbit holes and was just kind of following it and kind of observing it and kind of being curious about it and noticing the sensations that were arising in my body because of it, noticing the various stories that were emerging in this time and space in the context of reading the New Testament of the Bible, in the context of contemplating the interaction of religion and politics and commerce and money and racism, and looking at all these pillars of ideas that come together to formulate our perception of what reality is, or what our society, what our world framework is based upon, what the human story is based upon. Pretty soon, I'm listening to Noam Chomsky talk about nuclear war and the potential end of our species due to the interaction of global climate change and nuclear war. And that's a tangent I don't care to go down right now. Why? Because it's just a whole other thing, and there's so many pitfalls in here. There's so much muck in here because it's difficult to even have a conversation with most folks nowadays because everyone is so bought into a certain way of telling this story. Either you believe something or you don't believe something, or you believe another thing, or it's this whole thing that everyone is entitled to. But listening to Noam Chomsky, someone I truly admire, truly believe has spent his entire life being critical of powerful people, being critical of the stories we're telling ourselves and how we're telling them and why we're telling them. And being faced with information that is very scary, very challenging, very difficult. And, recognizing that most of us don't want, I would assume, this is me just contemplating out loud, but most of us are pretty damn scared to take that deep, long look in the mirror at what we have created and what we are fighting for and what we are afraid of and the story that we're co-creating. And are we happy with it? are we proud of it? Is this something worth pinning together and holding together and continuing to buy into it? Or did we lose our way at some point? Did we lose our way at some point? And so I was there, and I was looking at what we have created, what humanity has created, and the stories we have told ourselves, and the history of it, and the powerful people and the powerful lineages and the powerful entities and structures behind it all, and how the people buy into it all, and realizing that as long as human beings have had people willing to go against the tribe, people willing to hurt or harm or take more of their fair share, people who are willing to do the opposite of loving thy neighbor. There has always been people who will pervert and manipulate your beliefs and your ideas, like the gospel of Christ, which I think is beautiful and magnificent, and I'm not going down that road right now. But we take beautiful ideas and truths and practices, and we pervert them, or they become perverted by those who are deeply interested in and deeply vested in, and who deeply thrive off of all of us buying into those things and co-creating those things and pounding our fists and being angry at the other side. So I got to that place this morning, and I wanted to go into that place. I wanted to go into the shadow of our story. I wanted to allow myself, and perhaps my dreams the night before kind of brought me there, but just to take a good look in the mirror at how I'm buying into this thing and the stories I'm telling myself and what I have been told to believe and what I have been told to be afraid of, and what I have been told about the sensations in my body, and what I've been told about what I should find valuable and what I should not find valuable. And looking into that shadow space that we don't want to look at because it scares us. I found looking into that shadow space is a practice that's good for me. I think I'm coming to this place, or, the journey has brought me to this place where progressively I'm coming to terms with and coming to peace with the fact that my job is not to change anybody. My job is not to force my ideas on someone. My job is not to tell someone that they are wrong or incorrect, even though sometimes I might slip up. Sometimes I may. This is not about perfection. This is about taking a look in the mirror and acknowledging how you're acting, how you're behaving, what you're acting out, the stories you're telling, and doing that critically for myself, and recognizing there's a lot of times I'm acting in a way or acting something out automatically, or going into agreement with something automatically that I don't want to, that I would not choose to if I was being mindful about it, or if I was being brave about it, or if I was being critical about it. And something that I have become very curious about is my own denial and what I see as, I don't know that this is anything new per se, but what I see as systemic, culture-wide denial, systemic, culture-wide misinformation. But sticking with the denial part, being really honest with yourself and being really honest with the environment that you're living in, the world you're living in, and really looking at, well, how am I a part of this thing? And how am I playing into this thing? And what stories am I telling as part of this thing? And what am I reacting to? What is pulsing in my body in relation to what is being told or what is taking place? And how am I co-creating that with the words I speak? That was John. In the beginning was the Word. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. We speak things into being. And I find that our collective denial is astounding, and I have found that my own denial has been astounding. And we utilize denial because it can be quite scary to look in the mirror. It can be quite scary to question ourselves. It can be quite scary to wonder if the things that you are taking as truth have just been created for you. If they're just part of a story that has been created for you so that you can be scared into picking a side and picking a position and blaming the other and consuming in a certain way and telling the story in a certain way and reacting in a certain way and supporting it in a certain way, creating it and co-creating it in a certain way. So all that shit is going through my mind this morning, and I'm just letting my mind open up, and I'm letting myself take in these words, and I'm letting myself explore, Thessalonians, and talking about the end times and talking about the return of Christ. And then I'm listening to Noam Chomsky, and I'm looking at a very wise man who is alive today, looking at his way of perceiving what is taking place in our world right now. A man in his 90s who has spent his entire life being critical of government and power, and who has spent his entire life looking at how the language we speak and the stories we tell manifest, how they are created and co-created, what is the agenda behind them and the story behind them. So I got to that place and I decided to go for a hike, and I decided to go to the Santa Margarita trails, and I did that for my own well-being, for my own self-care, for my own practice. What I'm learning is, and what I'm finding is, I'm allowing myself to speak more honestly and to be more open and honest about my own life and my own practice and my own experience. And rather than saying, this is how you should think, or this is what I believe and you should believe, just doing my best to navigate the path that I'm walking and to be open about it and to be honest about it and to share my journey, no matter how winding that may be in this moment, and to realize that a value that I have is to, rather than tell people what they should believe or how they should think, I want to be very curious about how people think and believe themselves. What are the stories they're telling? How are they telling? Why are they telling them? Perhaps someone else has some knowledge I don't have. Perhaps their life journey has taught them something I have not yet learned. You will always learn more by being curious about why someone sees the world the way they see it than you will by imposing your own beliefs or perspectives on people. That's what blows my mind when it's hard to grab my head with these things on, but it blows my mind when I look at, in this case, both political parties, or when I look at different movements of people on whatever side you're on. And I'm just astounded. I really am astounded at how much people try to anger and fight and force and push their perspectives and beliefs on others. And how many double standards are built into that. How it's diametrically opposed to a lot of the philosophies and ideas and beliefs that are being put forward to sustain those points of view. And you realize when you really look into the political spectrum and everything about it, you just realize how contradictory it all is. You realize how it has been corrupted for as long as the human story has been corrupted. And you realize how much we buy into it automatically without questioning it at times. And this is just where my mind is going. So I think that you'll always learn a lot more by being curious about why people see the world the way they see it than we do about by just telling people how we think and feel and behave, and how dumb you are and how much I know. And if you don't think what I think, then you're an idiot and you're on the other side, and I'm going to be willing to hurt you or people you love. So I went out to one of my favorite hiking trails, and I found my way off the trail, and I found my way off to this place by the creek or the little river as it's flowing through, and it's this beautiful space. You know, the water is about 5 inches deep, and it's a little rippling, bubbling creek. And there's the occasional hummingbird, and there's the occasional, I don't know, sparrow, the occasional bee, the occasional critter. And it's just about as beautiful and breathtaking a space as you can find. I leave my phone at home. I'm sitting out there in a space where there's nothing around me that's trying to influence me other than the buzz of nature, other than the flow of that river. And I sit in that space, and I sat in that space, and I just kind of notice with my eyes closed for a while. Sometimes I open my eyes and I notice what is buzzing in my body, what is holding on in my body, what are the stories being told in my body. You know, what did these things that I read about and learned about and paid attention to this morning, how are they manifesting within me? And sitting in that moment and sitting in that space, and rather than getting particularly lost in those things or reacting to those things, just allowing those things to bubble to the surface, allowing the fear to bubble to the surface, allowing the story to bubble to the surface, seeing if I'm being honest with myself, seeing to what extent I'm bullshitting myself, looking at what are the deep down stories that I'm acting out and buying into in that present moment that are making me feel uneasy, that are making me feel scared, that are making me feel reactive, that are making me feel like I need to act out in a certain way, and progressively letting them kind of come in and out just like that water as it's flowing by, letting them come in and letting them come out and letting them float to the surface and letting them move on. And the place that I get back to that I find the most peace in, the place I get back to that I would say life's journey has presented to me, whether I like it or not, is that place of surrender. It's kind of being in this place of, okay, regardless of what's going on out there, regardless of what is happening in this particular time and space, regardless of what story is being shoved down your throat today, and regardless of how people are reacting to it or what's going on, what can I do in this present moment about it? Should I freak out about it? Should I panic about it? Should I externalize all my fear and make everyone around me scared? Should I be angry around everyone because, holy shit, everything's happening and we should freak out? And when I get into that space, what I ask myself is, what is the best way through this for me? What is the best way through this for my children? And I recognize that It's not my job to change everyone's point of view. In fact, I don't even know if I have the power to change anyone's point of view. And I notice that whenever anyone forces or judges or pushes or rants and raves, it's never a good way to sway people. It's never a good way to move people. It's never a good way to touch people's hearts. Something that really I use to guide how I navigate certain things is anyone that speaks from a place of fear, anyone that speaks from a place of division, I know that they are not someone I want to listen to. They are not someone to be inspired by. They're not someone I want to lead me. It's kind of my rule of thumb. If someone speaks or acts from a place of fear habitually, or they use fear to manipulate, I don't want anything to do with them. I don't care what they're attached to. I don't care what philosophy. I don't care what story. So in those places when I notice, like this morning, where I notice some feelings of, oh my God, look at all these things that are happening. Look at all this stuff that I should be afraid of. And for real, looking at what humanity has created and the fact that we have taken it upon ourselves to damage our home and to overconsume our home. And rather than considering ourselves a part of this thing, at some point someone utilized those religious stories we're told against us and told us that somehow we're separate from nature and we're not of nature, we're not part of nature, that God is not in nature and in us, that God is somehow separate or different or away from, and that we need some priest or president to tell us how to think or feel or believe. So those sensations of helplessness and hopelessness and powerlessness and those sensations of fear start to bubble up. And what do we call that? We call it depression and anxiety. And we have that story and we think now there's something wrong with us. I'm having these symptoms of depression. I'm having these symptoms of depression and anxiety during COVID when I'm completely cut off from the people I love and the things I love to do and the things that give me purpose. And I wonder why I'm experiencing those sensations. And rather than taking a pill to make myself more tolerant of the social isolation that's being forced upon me, how about I notice the sensations as a source of wisdom and I recognize something is wrong with this picture. Something about my body is telling me something is wrong with this picture. So I go sit down by the creek and I listen to my breath and I notice the thoughts and I notice the feelings and I let them bubble to the surface and I try to be compassionate to myself and I try to think of what is the best way through this for myself and my children, because I can't do much beyond that. I'm not here to force and can't, to an extent, on anybody else around me. And it's not my job to care about or be guided by how other people choose to perceive my behavior. Maybe my one responsibility is to take responsibility for myself, to take responsibility for the sensations in my body, to take responsibility for the stories that I tell in the context of those sensations, in the context of this time and place that I'm living in. And I do that work for my children, mostly. But I also do it because the entirety of my journey has told me that no amount of ranting and raving and fear and anger and sadness and pleading will actually do much of anything for anyone other than just go into the co-creation of it, go into the co-creating of fear and stories and division and separation and all that shit that is just really, really a great way of keeping us separate and keeping us misinformed and keeping us bought into a thing that, let's be honest, if we took the time to look into our shadow space, if we took the time to listen to our fears and look into our fears and look into it all, would we really want to create this thing this way? Do you really love being at the mercy of your insurance companies, for example? Do you really love the legalization of substances that kill a lot of people? On and on and on. I don't need to belabor it. So that's the story of my day. That's kind of how I navigated my day thus far. Once I find that place, I just try to stay with the breath, and I try to stay with it. And I try to notice, oh, there's another story coming in. Oh, there's another news headline. Oh, there's another thing he said. Oh, there's another thing she said. Oh, there's another thing I'm being told to be afraid of. Okay. What's the best way to be in this moment? What's the best I can do in this moment for me and my children? And anyone I love? My name is Mark Jesinoski. I'm a psychologist and an artist. This is the Wizard Podcast, called the Wizard Podcast because I work with a lot of Marines and they fancy calling psychologists wizards. If you think about it, it's kind of fitting that a warrior would go to see the wizard to make sense of the war, to make sense of the fight. At some point, the warrior says, what am I fighting for? Who am I fighting for? Why am I fighting? What's this all about? And that's just me reflecting what I've observed and what I've experienced. I have found so much wisdom in sitting with, just sitting with combat veterans, listening to their stories, listening to their questions, listening to their pain, listening to the confusion, listening to the strength. There's a lot of wisdom there that shit, man, as I think about it, as I really, really feel it and think about it, what do we do to our warriors who are full of wisdom? We tell them the sensations in their body are fucking diseases that need to go away and disorders that need to go away. We allow the system of medicine, the biggest socialized system of medicine in the world, to hand out fistfuls of pills to our men and women who serve, who are feeling alone and isolated and confused and in pain and forgotten by the people they serve. What do? We placate them behind a guise of medicine. We quarantine the men and women who serve behind a guise of medicine. We allow that to happen. Rather than listening to their stories and listening to the wisdom, listening to their questions of why did I do that? Who was I serving? What exactly am I standing for? What version of freedom am I fighting for? There's a lot of value in their stories. And we shut them up and we quiet them down and we push them away and we make them feel like they are forgotten and excommunicated because we are living in collective denial to quite an extent. We don't want to truly hear their stories because their stories might tell us that we are part of the destruction that they experienced. That our lives may be, to an extent, what they are because of things that are happening far outside our borders that we don't really want to know about, we don't really want to pay attention to. Because then we might have to take responsibility. We might have to start chipping away at our own denial and our own fear, we might have to start taking responsibility rather than hiding our shame and our responsibility behind denial. We might actually have to start listening So that's where the wizard came from. Getting to share space with lots and lots of a broad variety of veterans who have served overseas in combat and who have had their lives turned upside down and their perceptions turned upside down, and many of them who have gone very deep down the journey of healing and growing and becoming shamans of sorts, turning their pain, turning their feelings, turning those symptoms, those sensations into wisdom, into growth, rather than assuming they're broken, rather than assuming they're diseased or disordered, or what they have is something wrong with them. I've watched so many, I've been humbled by, and I've learned from, grown from all these men and women I've gotten to work with, continue to be so deeply informed by that. And I would encourage you to be curious as well about the veterans in your family. I didn't mean for this podcast all of a sudden be like a, rah veterans, but there is so much wisdom there in your families, in your communities, in your neighborhoods, everywhere. And a lot of these men and women do feel forgotten or misunderstood, or like all of the trauma, the generational trauma that they are carrying around, that they feel as a burden of our society. Think of what Vietnam veterans carried with them, what they still carry with them. Think of what Operation Iraqi Freedom and Enduring Freedom, think of what they carry with them, the stories they carry, and think of how they feel when we tell them, your story is just something that we need you to only talk about with the wizard behind closed doors, and here's your pill. Please don't bother me. I got shopping to do. All right, everybody, I think I've worn myself out. This is Mark Jesinoski. This is the Wizard Podcast, episode 37. I hope you all have a wonderful Sunday. Take care.